Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the EITC in 2018, What's Ahead for Working Families. I'm Lauren Pescatori, and I'm the Director of Tax Credits for Workers and Their Families. We are a national communications initiative that works with policymakers and advocates at the state and federal levels to develop communication strategies that promote tax credits for low-wage workers. And we're thrilled to be partnering with Prosperity Now to bring you this event focused on what's ahead for some of these policies in the coming year. Last Friday, we joined thousands of other organizations, policymakers, and advocates to celebrate EITC Awareness Day, a national effort to raise awareness of the Earned Income Tax Credit. The EITC is a vital program for keeping low-wage workers out of poverty and on a pathway to financial stability. But it's one of only many threads that stitch together our federal safety net, and the future of that lifeline for so many working Americans is uncertain in the wake of tax reform. Today, you'll hear from a panel of experts about the future of these policies in the coming year and just how important they are for working families. We have a jam-packed event ahead of us, so I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the day, Jeremy Greer. Jeremy is a Vice President of Policy and Research at Prosperity Now, where he directs the organization's state, local, and federal policy, applied research, and racial wealth divide teams. In this role, Jeremy develops strategies that help to alleviate poverty and build economic opportunity for all, many of which you'll be hearing more about today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jeremy up to the podium to kick things off.
Thank you, Lauren. So this is a really good-looking crowd, I must say. What I love about the EITC and the community around it is when you say those three letters, people show up, and this is just a great feeling to be in front of all of you. Thanks again for coming out. We welcome you to this event to talk about something that's really important to us. Let's start with a little background about Prosperity Now. You probably know us maybe as CFED, but we've changed our name because we thought the name Prosperity Now really spoke more to what was at the core value of why we do our work, about really helping families achieve prosperity and really get a foothold in the American economy. Really help families earn adequate income, help families access wealth-building assets that'll help them move ahead like a home or a business, and also be able to save and invest in their future. And that's really what we like to see for all families. But unfortunately, what brings us all here today is what we know, that too many families are basically a paycheck away from financial ruin if they haven't already experienced it. And that's the tough road that we have ahead. So I want to take a moment before going any further to thank some folks. Thank Lauren and from the Tax Credits for Working Families. Want to thank H&R Block for being the sponsor of this event once again. I think it's the third year that H&R Block has sponsored this event. Want to thank Sherrod Brown and his staff for getting this great room for us here at the Capitol Visitor Center. Want to thank the panelists that you're going to hear from for taking time out of their busy day and sharing the wealth of knowledge and expertise they have. And finally, they didn't put this on my talking points because they're humble, but I want to thank the Prosperity Now staff for all their hard work in putting this event together. And I'd like them all to hold their hands up so that they can get recognized by the group here. Come on, put your hands in. Again, I told you, they're just way too modest. It's really a privilege to work with such dedicated people. So why are we here, right? So 2017 was a wild ride. It was just this crazy wild ride. Chick and I were sitting down before the event talking about it. And it was wild, not in the sense of like a Six Flag roller coaster fun wild. Like, you kind of know where the curves are and where the twists are, and you know you're going to land and everything's going to be safe and fine. It's kind of more like runaway train with no brakes, not quite sure what's going to happen, but also, this could end at any time with really dire consequences. And that's kind of the sober reality that what we went through this last year. We had a tax bill pass the Congress that was incredibly skewed to benefit the most wealthy families. And what little benefit working families got is going to expire in a few years, and their taxes are actually going to go up as a result. The There was elimination of a key provision, the individual mandate in the Affordable Care Act, which is going to force a lot of families to lose their health insurance. We're going to probably pay for these tax cuts with cuts to critical programs like Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, food assistance, which is going to make it even more difficult for working families. And we clearly have a strategy for someone on the Hill in this building, in the administration, that isn't really thinking about how to invest in working families, but actually how to move ahead for those who really don't need the help. And that's really what's driving this conversation today. But we come at tax season. We're all coming here at tax season. And what we know and why I believe everybody's here is because we know this is a critical moment in the lives of the families that we support. During this moment, they get a chance to really reset, right? They get to pay back bills. They get to take care of some debt that has accumulated over time. They get to use that moment to really kind of restart the year and start the year anew. Also, it's a moment for them to recharge. They're able to take some of that money, put it away in a savings account, because they know coming in the year, there's gonna be bumps along the road. They're gonna get hit with that unexpected expense. Someone in their family is gonna get sick, and they know they're able to put that money away to be able to prepare for those moments. And the earned income tax credit is the most critical tool that we have at our disposal to support those families. In the 2017 tax season, 27 million tax filers claimed $65 billion in the earned income tax credit, with an average return of $2,445. For a family of four, married couple with 2 kids, at about $40,000 a year in income, that equated to an EITC of $2,226, which is the equivalent of 6% of their income. So families, just in 2017, got a 6% bonus from working. I can't think of anything more American than that. You work hard, you're rewarded, and you get a bonus. That's an incredible, incredible, powerful tool. Aside from that, research has shown that the EITC has huge impacts on things that aren't directly related to someone's income. Something like better infant health, improved test scores, boost college attendance, increases earnings, of course, and then also has shown to contribute to higher Social Security benefits in retirement. So just by earning income, they're building assets that are going to take them into retirement through their Social Security benefits. Boosting the power of the earned income tax credit is the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program, or VITA, where every year, well, just last year, over 1.4 million returns at 4,300 VITA sites across the country to provide free tax prep to families so that they could fully benefit from this incredible tool that is available to them. Meaning they didn't have to spend a dime of that tax return in order to get that money, so they could put that back into their families. Because tax prep costs, on average, about $261. And I'll tell you, a low-income family, that's a lot of money. And there's something they can do with that money if they didn't have to pay for it to get their tax return done. We're talking about VITA. It returned $2.1 billion to families in 2017. And the program is a $15 million program. I can't think of a better return on investment, people. The $15 million of investment returns back to families, $2.1 billion. You're gonna have a hard time finding that return in a lot of the programs that we have here that are passed every year through appropriations here on the Hill. The accuracy rate of VITA is 93%. So if VITA was an NBA basketball player, it would have a better free throw percentage than Stephen Curry. Now, I have to tell the story, I'm sorry. I ran this by my son last night, who's 12 years old, he's a big basketball fan. And in the analogy, I used Larry Bird. And he looked at me really seriously, and he was like, you know, he's taking his job seriously, like I'm asking for his advisement, right? And he said, you know, Dad, that's good, but they're gonna think you're really old. Which of course made me feel old. And I took his advice to hear, adjusted Stephen Curry. So what do we do, right? What are we gonna do as we are on this train? How are we gonna become not just passengers on a train that's kind of taking us here and there, tossing us here and there? There's a lot of things that we as advocates can do to really affect this outcome. One of them is what a lot of groups here have been advocating for. We need to expand the earned income tax credit, right? This is a proven program that has returned resources to families. It is a huge investment in families every year. But right now, if you're a non-custodial parent, you get very little. So a single filer gets about $225 back from the earned income tax credit. Now, I'm a child of divorce, and my mom did a great job, but so did my dad. You know, just because they weren't together did not mean that he wasn't involved emotionally, financially. And if my dad were as hardworking as he was, an earned income tax credit recipient, he wouldn't get much back for that time and investment and that work that he had, that he put forth. And it's a flaw. It's a huge flaw in the program that we need to rectify. The other is we need to make VITA permanent. Again, the return on investment, $15 million, returns $2.1 billion back to families every year. This is a temporary program that we have to come up here every year and try to justify and try to fight for funding for. It should be made permanent. The VITA Permanence Act of 2017 would authorize VITA and provide $30 million for VITA programs so that they can reach more people and really boost up that participation in the earned income tax credit, and then help those families get down a road of financial security. And this is really important, people, we need to create minimum standards for tax preparers. So many earned income tax credit filers go to unscrupulous tax preparers who are only in business to take advantage of people. That's their whole source of business. Ladies, the hairdresser that does your hair goes through more regulation and red tape than a tax preparer does. And a tax preparer is dealing with sensitive financial information of families and dealing with something that's really highly technical and very confusing. And basically, anyone off the street could prepare anyone's tax returns. This just isn't right. And there has to be some minimum standard that requires some sort of training to start with, that there's some continuing education because the tax law changes every year, and that they have to pass some basic competency to prove that they could do it. None of us could get behind a wheel and drive a car before we proved to the government in some way that we weren't going to ruin somebody's life. And it's the same thing when it comes to tax. And then finally, we should establish a rainy day EITC. The EITC is a critical tool, it's an important tool, it's a great tool. But what we know is it's just simply not enough. A lot of families that money runs out halfway through the year. Halfway through the year, They paid off all the bills. They've, gotten the kids ready for school. They maybe had that emergency in the winter. Maybe they had to get the boiler fixed, keep the heat on, and that money's gone. What we like to see is some mechanism which a family could voluntarily put a portion of their EITC away into an interest-bearing account and be able to access that later in the year so that it can take them to that next infuse of income at the next tax year. There's a bill that's being put around the Hill. Senator Booker is the likely going to be the sponsor. Is he the sponsor? Sponsor that bill? I look at David so I don't get in trouble. And part of that bill is to also create a pilot program so that we can test some strategies around matching savings so the families could get a boost on that earned income tax credit even further by matching what they put away for later in the year. And we'd love anyone that's interested, we'd love your support and help in moving that forward through Congress. Unfortunately, though, with all these ideas, all these things that we can do, a lot of the conversation here on the Hill has been in the other direction. It's really been looking at threatening a lot of the programs that are so critical to families, providing tax breaks to the very wealthy rather than investing in something like this that we know has EITC has such a catalytic effect on households. And in the process, to pay for some of it, we're attacking critical programs, some of them I mentioned earlier. The other thing that's really troubling, has found really troubling in the last tax bill, is even when we try to do something right, for example, increasing the child tax credit, right? It's a great thing to do, like the EITC. Well, what we did was we said, well, all the increases in the child tax credit are going to go to the very wealthy, it's stub filers, and we're not going to give it to immigrant children that don't have Social Security numbers. People that are here legally, their parents earned income here in this country, they filed their taxes like they're supposed to, and we're not going to give them this benefit and opportunity. We have to stop penalizing families, and we have to start investing in the future of families, and that's what I hope that we can move towards 2018 and beyond. So, you're going to hear from a panel that's going to provide much brighter outlook than I did. So today we're going to have some esteemed panelists that are going to discuss hashtag, again, I'm not that old, hashtag future of the EITC, and going to talk about what lies ahead and what folks would like to see happen for their earned income tax credit. So with that, I'm going to invite David Newville, who's our Federal Director of Federal Policy at Prosperity Now. He's going to moderate the panel. I'll ask the panelists to come up and join the panel so it can get kicked off. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, and we look forward to working with everybody as we try to expand this program and make it more powerful than it already is. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jeremy, for those opening remarks and kind of framing the conversation here today. And thank you all for joining us. I'm David Newville with Prosperity Now, we have just a few things to talk about today, apparently, just a few things going on related to tax and low-income families. I have to say, we'll jump in pretty quickly. I think Jeremy did a great job of framing this, but we have a pretty all-star panel here that I'm very excited about as far as, I can't imagine picking a better panel when you're talking about anything related to low-income families and tax time, and as mentioned earlier, we have a lot to cover here. So I will do brief introductions. There's more detailed introductions in the packets that you all have, and more background materials from all the organizations and speakers that we have here today. But I'll briefly introduce everyone, starting with Aparna to my left. So Aparna Mathur is a resident scholar of economic policy at the American Enterprise Institute and has done a ton of very thoughtful writing and research related to children and families, including the EITC, so very excited to have her here. And then we also have a longtime friend of Prosperity Now, Francesca Jean-Baptiste, with the Maryland Cash Campaign, which, among many other things, is one of the most effective volunteer income tax assistance programs, as Jeremy mentioned earlier, in Maryland, and serving thousands of Marylanders. So great to have her. And then we have Daniel Turrentine, who's the Vice President and Chief Government Affairs Officer at H&R Block, who brings a wealth of knowledge related to both research and tax policy. And Block I believe, serves more low-income families than anyone else in the country right now. So a wealth of data and experience there. So it's great to have Dan. And then last but not least, we have Chai-Ching Huang, who's is the Deputy Director of Federal Tax Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And if you weren't following her Twitter feed during tax reform, you missed out, because it was a must read as far as updates and analysis of everything that came down the pike during that time. So we'll launch in. We'll start at a high level and kind of talk about, for those who are not as familiar, how does tax time fit into the financial lives of low-income families? How does the EITC fit in? And then we'll move into the implications of tax reform and some of the more detailed aspects of tax time, as far as to get in a little more detail about some of the proposals out there that Jeremy mentioned, and potential fixes, barriers, what's ahead, as well as asset building, financial capability, and some of the other things that involve tax time. But we'll start, as I said, big picture about what does tax time mean for low-income families? What kind of impact does it have on their lives? How does the EITC play into that? How does the tax preparation process play into that, whether someone goes to a paid preparer or goes to a Vita site or a mom and pop shop? So I'll start by throwing that out to Francesca and Dan, having most of the direct interaction with taxpayers, but then anyone else who wants to jump in, feel free to do it.
Sure. This is on. So Dan Turrentine with H&R Block. So we believe we do more EITC returns than anyone in the country. And we're both online and retail. In fact, if you go online, you can do EITC, your return for free. We don't charge for it online at this time. But we have 10,000 stores nationwide, and we very much see the impact of the EITC really in people's faces. When people come in, most of our clients are low to middle income, and when we go through the process and tell them how much money they're getting back, we see people break down in tears. We are in rural communities, urban communities. We have been around for 63 years. Not only do we see the emotional impact of when people are told how much they're getting back, but we offer financial products, including a prepaid debit card, because a lot of our clients either are unbanked or underbanked, and we have a line of sight as to how they spend that money. And unlike a lot of the stereotypes that you hear, that they're going to Best Buy to buy a new television, or they're going to Foot Locker to buy a new pair of Air Jordans, to date myself here. Right. What we see is that money gets spent immediately on rent, medical expenses, a new tire for the minivan, food. I mean, just basic necessities of life, and it is spent immedately. We actually did a pilot program with the CFPB to try to encourage savings. And of the 600,000 people that there was some money that was offered as an incentive to save, of the 600,000 people that were targeted, only 36 took it. All 36 withdrew the savings, and it was like $10 within 30 days. And it wasn't because they were greedy. It wasn't, again, because they were going to Best Buy. It was because they needed the money. And what we see often is people have spent this money in their head prior to coming to the tax desk. They've spent it, during the holidays. They are due, back on their rent. And so by the time they come to the tax desk, it's almost too late to incentivize behavior. They're tired, it's the end of the day, your children's tugging on your leg, you just want to get your tax, do it right, get your money back, and go on with your lives. And sitting there and saying, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about, it's like, stop. Give me, or you go to the bank to deposit your check. I'm looking around this room, a lot of you probably never been to a bank to deposit a check. But if you did, you just want to get through the line and get on your way. So, we have a lot of experience, we have a lot of insight into this. And we can absolutely attest that it is an unbelievably powerful tool to helping people meet the challenges of their lives, and we're here to help.
Great. Thanks. And I just turned it off. Okay, so I'm Francesca Jean-Baptiste with the Cash Campaign of Maryland, so we're really close, 45 minutes away. And we serve about 22,000 families and individuals in Maryland, bringing back over $3 million in federal and Maryland state refunds. And I couldn't agree with you more, Dan. We know that when clients are coming to us, coming through our doors, they have already spent that money. It is gone. They've done it in their head. They know exactly how much they expect that they're going to get. It is often the largest injection of cash that they're going to see, the biggest lump sum they're going to have all year. And so they wait for it. They know it, what it's supposed to be. And if it's a couple of dollars left, they definitely want to know why. And so they are spending it right in their local communities: food, clothing, rent, paying bills. It is definitely, folks are getting all of their necessities. They're not buying extravagant products. They're really just trying to live day to day, get caught up. So, Cash is really focused on talking to folks about everything that they can do to be spending their money as wisely as possible. We do talk to folks about savings. We talk to every single person that comes through our door. Unfortunately, as I said, the refunds are already spent. Folks are just trying to catch up. But the EITC is definitely important because it does provide that additional money back in their pocket. It's a refundable credit, so it's super important. So we are always trying to get the word out to folks about the EITC, about free tax preparation. We save about $5 million in tax prep fees from folks coming to our VITA programs. But again, it's really tough to get the word out to folks about free tax preparation, but we are doing it. We're getting our boots to the ground, getting all of our flyers out, doing all of our TV ads, telling folks to come get their taxes done for free by quality and trained tax preparers, so they're not falling into the traps with folks that are just setting up shop for those 90 days of tax season that are going to just take their money and run.
Great. So that's a great overview. Thank you both. So we're getting these important, these refunds, trying to get services to folks at the right time, trying to connect them at this important moment. The process of doing that is a challenge. So the actual, the credits themselves, obviously the EITC plays a big role in that, but others as well as CTC. Jeremy alluded to this in his opening remarks. We have a lot of research on this is more than just giving people a lot of money in tax time, which can make up a huge percentage of their annual take-home pay. There's long-term effects, obviously incentivizing work, but for children, for health, for long-term effects on those children and others. Aparna and Chai-Ching, could you talk a little bit about that? I think people are familiar with some of these benefits, but I don't think people realize how extensive they are necessarily for some of these credits and the refund process overall.
Right, that's a great sort of starting point. The reason we like the EITC is, as researchers and as policy people, I think what gets bipartisan support for the EITC is that it's a pro-work and a pro-family policy. So the advantage of the EITC is that it's not welfare. It's not, you don't have to go to an agency and say, oh, I need to claim some cash. This is a policy that comes to you because you worked, and the research shows that people feel a lot of dignity in getting money through the EITC because they feel they've earned it. It's not cash welfare. You don't have to go to an office and say, oh, I need the money. It's I earn the money through the course of the year, and this is from my work. So we love the EITC. It's a pro-work, pro-family policy. As I said, we've seen a bunch of research now. The EITC has been around for decades. And as a result of that, in economics, we have a ton of literature, a ton of research suggesting that this has actually been really good for families. It's an anti-poverty program. Just in 2016, we have evidence showing that it lifted more than 7 million people out of poverty, of which 4 million are children. So that's a huge, huge benefit. At the same time, it's incentivized employment. And when you look at the structure of the EITC is a lot more generous for single parents with children. It's a little bit less generous if you. It's actually significantly less generous if you don't have a child and you're just a single adult. But when you look at the differences across demographics, what it has really achieved is encouraged more single mothers, more single parents to be in the workforce. So there's a ton of evidence saying that it has really driven employment among single mothers to be in the labor force, to participate actively. It has increased their after-tax wages by 45% or more in many cases, and this is particularly at the lowest end of the income distribution. I think another reason why it has a lot of support is that it's a very well-targeted policy. So, we love the child tax credit. I think, it's great that families get more money when they have children. But the child tax credit is actually less well-targeted than the EITC. It extends way up the income ladder, and the current tax bill has, in fact, extended the eligibility for the CTC even more. But the EITC is very narrowly targeted on the lowest income people. And I think that's a big reason why you've been able to use the EITC to give a lot of money relatively to these lowest income families. So if you look at, the single parents with 3 or more children, it's very generous. You could get a refund of about $6,000 or more. It's slightly less generous if you have 2 children, the least generous if you have no children. It's about $500 max if you don't have a child. And so it's easy to see the labor force participation impacts of that because the dollar amounts are so dispersed. And we do find that it's incentivized single mothers with children a whole lot more to be in the labor market. Also, as David mentioned, there's a ton of research looking at the health impacts of the EITC. So we know that when families have more money coming in through the EITC, there's a positive impacts on maternal health, on child health, on children's test scores. There are long-term impacts on, as Jeremy mentioned, on college attendance and so on. And it's intuitively that makes a lot of sense. We are giving more money to families with children. It's tied to work, so it keeps them in the labor market, and it's also supplementing incomes at the bottom. So I think, overall, there's a ton of positive research associated with the EITC. It has a lot of support, and frankly, to me, it's very surprising that was not something that was addressed in the current tax bill. Given the element of consensus on how good the EITC is for families, I was amazed that it did not make it into the tax bill last year.
That's a great overview of the research understanding. I just want to echo that, yes, there is this growing consensus built on a really robust set of research, much of it actually quite recent, and the body of research just keeps growing. I think one of the things that's really important about the sort of discussions that we've had is that you've heard about how people take the EITC and spend it on a variety of different things that are what their family needs. And now we're seeing that research shows that whatever it is that they're spending it on, and again, we're seeing that it's mostly basic needs, and a lot of it actually is forward-looking, opportunity-building things as well. It's having these effects across the life cycle of children that are in families that receive the credits. So I think that connection is really important. It's also particularly important in the context of this panel because you can only see those benefits if people claim the credits that they're entitled to. EITC actually has a very relatively high participation rate given for a government program. Over 80% of people claim it. But that means that there are still billions of dollars left on the table for people who don't know about it or don't have access to appropriate tax preparation. So that's why I just like to sort of shove into my answer to this question, and just a huge thanks, echo the huge thanks of everybody who's already mentioned this, for the VITA volunteers, the people that are doing outreach, that are sort of on the ground making sure that people have access to these credits, because we wouldn't see any of that impact across families and across the life cycle unless people claim the credits.
Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah, so you both raise important points, and part of accessing these credits and kind of really getting the impact of these credits is obviously making sure it's targeted to the right people and the right amounts, but also making sure the administration actually works for folks on the ground as well. Maybe, and I think this is something that everyone in the panel can weigh in on both sides of those, thinking about what are the barriers right now to improving this program? We know it's really important. We know tax time is really important, but it's not working as smoothly as it could. There's a lot of issues on one side There's program integrity issues with EITC, right, and accessing that. The take-up rate isn't as high with EITC as it could be. It is high, but it could be higher, right? There's a lot of families who miss out on it. On the administrative side, Jeremy mentioned this in his opening, you have really good preparers. The VITA has this extremely high tax preparer accuracy percentage rate. A lot of the professional firms obviously train their staff, so they're doing well, doing a good job as well for the most part. But then you have others who are kind of fly by night or mom and pop shops who may not be as good. So that can really not only help people miss accessing this credit, but can also put them in fraudulent situations where they get stuck into issues with the IRS or a debt trap and so forth. So as I said, everybody I think on the panel has comments to make on this broad subject. But let's talk about the barriers and the ways we could improve tax time in the EITC. Yeah.
So I guess.
Go ahead. No,
sorry,
please.
David,
Please.
Go on. Okay.
Go ahead. Ladies first. Ladies first.
I'll be quick.
That's okay.
No, exactly as you mentioned, David, I think one of the issues we often face when we talk about why not expand the EITC is that you often get this pushback, well, the error rate in the EITC is really high, which means that there is people who are not eligible for the EITC are still claiming the EITC. The IRS estimates that's about 21 to 25% of all payments. It's a huge chunk of money, and at the end of the day, what that means is that the IRS is actually spending a lot of money trying to audit on the individual, within the individual income tax returns. About 39% of audits are for EITC claimants, which sounds to me a bit crazy because why worry so much about the overclaiming at the bottom end of the income distribution when clearly we have much larger issues at the top end. But that's a huge thing. The fact that we are overpaying money out of the EITC. And I think the reason that happens is that I don't think it's a lot of fraud. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about who can claim the EITC. So Jeremy, as you mentioned, a lot of times it's two parents with one child. And if they're separated or divorced, there are residency tests on how long the child has been with each parent and who can therefore claim the EITC. And I think there's just some amount of misunderstanding that both parents can't claim it, or you have to meet the residency test for you to be able to claim the EITC. So that's a big issue, and I think we can definitely improve that by making those definitions clearer and also making them more uniform by using the same definitions as maybe we use for the child tax credit. So we've made these programs, pretty complex for low-income taxpayers to use. So which is the big reason why they're trying to use tax preparers to claim something that should be coming to them easily. These are not a big chunk of this population is not actually facing a tax liability. They're really claiming the EITC because it's a refundable tax credit. You can get the cash without having a tax liability. So we should make it easy for them to do so. So just as we see issues with people overclaiming when they're not eligible for the benefit, I think it's also true to point out that there are a lot of people who are eligible for the benefit but are not claiming it because they feel like they're not eligible for it. So that's an issue as well, and I think we can address that by sort of standardizing the definitions of a qualifying child across different programs. I also think, there's some research on sort of the marriage penalty in the EITC. The fact that, if you're single parents and you're claiming the EITC, you get a slightly higher amount than if you file jointly and started claiming the EITC because your income often goes outside the threshold for claiming the EITC. So there's a marriage penalty, and I think one of the good suggestions there is to introduce a secondary earner deduction. So allow the secondary earners' income to be deducted from their taxable income when they're claiming the EITC. And the third is, the issue with these unenrolled preparers that the IRS talks about, the fact that people are going to these agencies that are not really professional, they're not legitimate. I mean, they're legitimate, they're allowed to do this, but they're not doing it in the best interests of the client, and they're often, messing up the claims. And I think addressing that through expansion of the VITA program, I think makes a lot of sense.
So, I mean, I would echo a lot of that. I think we have been calling for minimum standards for tax preparers for years because I think one of the things is there's kind of the world as we wish it, would be, and there's the world as it is. And I think for a lot of these people, they are very cost conscious, they are very cash strapped, They see these fly-by-nights. They often set up around our stores, I'm sure around Vita or the cash campaign in Maryland, kind of like car dealers congregate around one another. They will offer you, $10 to get your taxes done and a haircut. Because yes, hairdressers are regulated in all 50 states, but tax preparers are not. Any of you could open a laptop or do it on your phones right now for nothing on free Wi-Fi in the Capitol Visitor Center, and you're talking the most important financial transaction of the year. So one, it's complicated, and I'd like to say there's no fraud, but there is a lot of fraud, because one of the things that we see is you will come into our stores. If you come in and you're going to get our expertise, we do charge for the service. They'll say, how much am I going to get back before we've done their taxes? We say, well, we have to do your taxes before we can make that. Well, the person down the street said, it's $10 and I'm going to get $5,000 back. And we say, look, we cannot guarantee you this. So if you're cost conscious, and let's say we're going to be $150, and we can't guarantee you what your return will be, your money back is until we do your taxes. If you're low income and you're living on the edge, you're like, hey, I'm going to this person. There's another part of this. So one, are they doing it correctly is a big issue. Often it's not, because there's an optimization point on the EITC, at which point the refund is maximized, and then to avoid the cliff effect, there's a back of the curve in which it comes down. People have figured this out, and so they realize if any of you do your taxes online software, you enter your information, and the little odometer goes, up, 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 or down, down, down. And as you're putting your info, you're like, oh man, my refund just went down. Ooh, it just went back up. Well, people are aware of this as they do it. The other thing is people need capital. They have short-term capital needs, and this goes into the fly-by-night problem. A lot of them are payday lenders. So if you're going to come in and you're going to get, this is where the PATH Act kind of came into effect. It was, I think, an unintended consequence. You're coming in, you go to Vita, you go to the cash campaign, they say, okay, your refund's going to be $2,500. You'll see it in a couple weeks. And people say, whoa, I need that money right now. My rent is due next month. I'm 2 months behind. If I don't pay it, I'm out. So they go to a payday lender. Well, a lot of fly-by-nights are payday lenders too. And so they'll say, one, I'm doing it for $10. Two, I'm going to guarantee you, $5,000 back. By the way, I'll give you $2,000 right here, and I'll take the rest. And these people say, done, deal. There's not even a question. And so we see this. We used to offer a refund advance loan years ago. We then got out of the business because regulators had a lot of issues. We have gone back in with a loan, true story, interest-free, fee-free, and recourse-free. We are paying the issuance rate to the bank to loan to clients. Recourse-free means that if you come in and it turns out that you're not getting the refund back and you can't repay it, we eat the loan. So you'd say, we're a for-profit company. What's the catch? The catch is we were losing people to payday lenders and fly-by-nights because people were so desperate for short-term capital. The need has never dissipated. The last thing that I would say is that's a challenge here is the change not only of the family, so no longer even a two-parent home or a single-parent home. The uncle helps with it. You're not only taking care of kids, you maybe are taking care of your parents or your grandparents, etc. The other part is the changing nature of the economy, which is a gig economy. A lot of you are probably familiar with the term side hustle. You're getting income from all different sources, and it is complicated, and there is an optimization point. And so a lot of this has not changed to kind of, the fly-by-nights and others have trouble taking into account, or they dial turn. And where we see problems is people come into our stores crying, because just as they have spent that money in their head, and when they get it, it physically goes out the door, they don't have it when the IRS or the Maryland Department of Revenue sends a letter and says, oh, by the way, you owe $2,500 or $1,000. And they come into our offices in tears. And, we work through them, but at the end of the day, they owe this money, and the money is out the door. And so there are all of these challenges. We would completely echo simplification, the standardizing the definition of child. We don't take a point of view on tax legislation, but tax administration we do. And simplification is definitely something that is needed in this credit and others.
I'll just echo a lot of what's been said by sort of making three broad points on this error issue. I think first it's really key to understand what the sources of error are, and we've heard some of that. A lot of it is unintentional, not fraud. It's also important when you hear the error rates to understand that when those error rates are calculated, they count the overpayments going to people that shouldn't have claimed the credit, but they don't net out the fact that, for example, in a family where one parent claimed the child who shouldn't have, the other parent should have claimed it, they count the overpayment but not the underpayment to the parent that should have claimed the child. So there's some lack of netting there. I think the third thing to understand is that about 40% of claims found to be erroneous in audit, the National Taxpayer Advocate found, were actually valid when the claimant had assistance in providing the right paperwork, the right details, filling in the forms. So I think that's some context to understand. The second thing is I think there are a bunch of easy, simple things that can be done. First is to fund VITA. We've heard about how great their rates are. The second is to understand why that is the case. And I know you can talk more about the rigorous training that VITA volunteers go through, and that this is basically one of the things that we should be looking at for those unscrupulous and incompetent paid preparers, is requiring them to meet some of the same basic standards that we require volunteers to do. The third thing that I would just note is a sort of a little bit of context. We're just talking about the tax bill. Aparna mentioned, and I think this is a really important point, we spend a lot of time in this room and in the broader tax community talking about errors in the EITC. Disproportionate amount of time compared to where the errors in the tax code actually are and where the tax gap dollars are actually going. As mentioned, that's mostly high-income tax avoidance, corporate tax avoidance, things that are happening at the top. We hear very little about the fact that audit rates on millionaires have been falling. We hear very little about the fact that enforcement across the IRS as a whole, the budget has been cut by about a fifth, and enforcement staff are down by 25% since 2010. So these are some of the issues that I think are systemic to the tax system, and that we've just made a whole lot worse with a tax bill that creates huge new opportunities for tax avoidance, particularly around things like pass-throughs and international tax games that can be played. And again, I think it's good to sort of understand what we can do at this area, and we always want to keep pushing forward and making things more accurate and giving certainty to low-income filers that they've done their taxes correctly. But I think in terms of the bigger picture, I think some balance in the way that we focus on this issue is called for.
Yeah. And I just want to add, just harp on the back of what everyone's been saying, but simplification is really the key. I mean, try explaining to someone the difference between a qualifying child and a qualifying relative that's actually their child. Seriously, it is mind-blowing for people. They're like, their eyes are just glazing over when I'm trying to tell them that their actual child is really going to be their qualifying relative. They just do not get it. So I can't stress enough how much simplification of that and some education around the earned income tax credit can go a really long way in helping to avoid some of these improper payments for folks. I mean, our clients are really just out here trying to make it I know there are some folks that are, have it down to the, the number, the dot, and are really, trading siblings or trading kids that, they're really working the system. But most of our folks are really just trying to get by. And if they could understand what that means, what the different requirements are, I really feel like some of those issues around improper payments would really go away.
I can actually echo. As part of my promotion to running the office, I took our income tax course. We do 60 hours of training. You have to pass a criminal background check, which you would think is a no-brainer, but again, there's no standards.
In Maryland.
And take continuing education. And there was a whole section on dependency and definition of child and the different credits and how it kept changing. And I like to think I'm fairly, intelligent. My friends and family would probably disagree, but my head spun. I mean, I could not believe how it changes and the constant updates that are being made to it. And to your point, the fact that there's just no, there's no standards. it is ripe for just outright confusion and error. So it's a challenge. And even I'll make a pitch. Hurricanes, one of the things that they just issued in one of the hurricane relief packages is that if you're in an impacted area and your income was impacted, so you were on path to make $25,000 a year, and now you're only going to make 19 because your employer's just gone. They passed in the bill that you can now use your 2016 income tax return for 2017 to determine EITC eligibility. But that is an example of just they passed something. I bet you 80% of the preparers, not at H&R Block, but at other places, do not know this. And so there is just an instance where people are probably not going to claim it in parts of Houston and Florida that are greatly impacted, and it'll just be a shame that people did not hear about it.
Absolutely. And even in Maryland, where we do have regulation and standards for our tax preparers, just because it happens so quickly, a lot of folks are still not going to know.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Just if they're not really diligent about keeping up with all of the tax law changes. So, thinking about places where there aren't standards, it's just, again, ripe for problems.
In fact, I'll beat the horse one last time, and I promise I'll stop. Maryland shut down, we will not name the competitor, 17 of their stores in Maryland on state returns, because Maryland's one of 5, Connecticut now is the 5th, states with minimum standards. Those shut down stores could still process federal returns, and they did.
Yeah.
So they had been caught
By the comptroller.
by the comptroller, Peter Franchot, but he was powerless to stop them on the federal level, and they kept pumping out federal returns.
Yep. Wow. So even with standards, they're
Right.
still,
So plenty of areas for improvement. And speaking of tax law changes, so obviously Jeremy helped frame it, and many of you already alluded to the shark in the water, but the obviously once-in-a-generation tax reform happened, and given the clear importance of these programs and the barriers and the fact that the lowest income among us, the most financially fragile, should be the priority for any tax reform, right? I'm sure this legislation would take all that up. Obviously I kid, but looking at the impact of tax reform, and I think it's confusing for a lot of folks because we have the final tax bill, we had the House bill, we had the Senate bill. There are a variety of proposals out there being floated around even just the child tax credit alone, and there were earlier changes floated to the EITC, and there ended up being very minor changes, but important changes to the EITC. So can we talk a little bit about that? Like how did this end up affecting low-income families, both the actual changes to the tax code itself, but then when you look at the larger pictures around individual mandates, expiration dates, those types of things, and how you pay for it, but also the tax law itself. Where do low-income people end up with it? Because I know many folks, we're just talking about this, now that Friday is almost here, we're into February, people are going to start seeing changes to their withholding. They're going to start impacting folks. And I think a lot of, especially low-income folks, are going to notice this and wonder what's going on. So where do we end up on all this?
So just to recap a bit of what Jeremy said, overall the tax bill was very tilted towards high-income people, sort of facing economic challenges, particularly for low and moderate income people, of wage stagnation and income polarization. This bill overall just took those problems and made them worse. Most of the tax cut relief was directed at multinationals, large corporations, high-income people. So despite the rhetorical focus as we sort of moved into this process around raising workers' wages, we left out the EITC completely, proven, as we know, to increase work effort and boost incomes and have a whole range of good effects for families. And in fact, the bill slowly cuts the value of the EITC with a slower measure of inflation over time, and it's doing that to pay for permanent corporate tax cuts. So that right there is sort of encapsulation of the prioritization of this bill. A few years out, but that couple making $40,000 with 2 kids that Jeremy mentioned before, they would see their EITC shrink by about $300 by 2027, just by the slower measure of inflation. And the CTC, as you mentioned, there was a lot of focus on this. This is really a case of look below the headline. You sort of hear a lot about the fact that the CTC was doubled. For low-income families, that's not the case. For 10 million children in low-income working families, their maximum CTC increase is $75 or less per family, and then a slow measure of inflation adjustment going forward. For about 14 million more children, they get less, and in many cases far less, than the maximum boost in the CTC, and then the highest income families get the maximum boost. So again, a sort of a hole in that situation, with the kicker that, as Jeremy mentioned, for about 1 million kids in immigrant families who were eligible for the child tax credit, they are no longer eligible for the child tax credit because of this bill. And again, these are these are children overwhelmingly who are going to be part of our communities and our economy going forward. We're missing out on all of these benefits for children, making them stronger contributors to our families, our communities, as we've seen from the research, by taking that credit away. So it's really a case of a huge missed opportunity. There are big a variety of proposals to move forward on both of these tax credits, making them more refundable at the bottom end, improving the childless worker EITC, boosting the credits overall to capitalize on this research and evidence-backed set of things that we know that they're delivering, but the bill sort of it was absent from that conversation.
Yeah, so when I look at the bill, I think the priority for Republicans was really to do corporate tax reform. You know, this is, I agree there wasn't a whole lot of redistribution in this bill, right? We didn't see any expansions of the EITC. As I said, you know, there was bipartisan support for expanding the EITC to childless adults, to just increasing the amounts of the EITC, but it didn't come through in the tax bill. What the tax bill did on the individual side was to lower rates. So they have lowered marginal tax rates. If you look at you know, starting from, for people at the very top end of the income distribution, the rates have gone down from 39% to something like 37%. But the income at which you have to pay those rates has also significantly, you know, there's a bigger exemption. So you only pay those high tax rates at very, very high, much higher income levels than you had to pay the top rate before. So I would say there was an across-the-board cut in marginal income tax rates. They had, you know, the marginal personal income tax rates. They did away with the personal exemption, but in place of that, they doubled the standard deduction, which means that a lot fewer people will now find it beneficial to itemize. So, you know, they're going to they're not going to be using a lot of the itemized deductions that they were using before because they've doubled the standard deduction. I think on net, most low-income families are, you know, probably held whole by that. I don't think it would have hurt them. They did expand the child tax credit. Again, the problem with the child tax credit is that it's not fully refundable. So you only get a certain proportion of your income back through the child tax credit. It's not like the EITC, which is you know, completely refundable. And so they did increase the refundability of the child tax credit as well, which is why, you know, a higher dollar amount would now go to lower income families. But they also increased the eligibility for the CTC at the higher end of the income distribution. So again, many more people would benefit from it. And I suspect, again, a big reason for doing that was that they removed the personal exemptions. And then they also added a $500 non-child dependent credit. All of these credits expire in 2025. So, you know, all of the things that on the individual end expire. And I think the hope is that if they persist for the next 8-9 years, no administration will be able to take them away. And so, you know, in some sense, the hope is that they would be permanent. On the corporate side, I think, you know, I'm not as dismissive about the corporate side reforms. I do think business side reforms were needed in the U.S. You know, both sides, even under President Obama, there was action to cut the corporate tax rate to make it more competitive with other countries globally. You know, the OECD average corporate tax rate was more than 10 percentage points lower than what we have in the U.S. And I think they are trying to make the U.S. corporate tax system more competitive. The idea is to get more investment in the U.S. and in the long run, you know, create more jobs, create higher wages for workers. So I'm not as dismissive on the business side. I do think that there is a worry that, you know, the corporate tax cuts are permanent, the individual ones aren't. But it's much tougher, I think, for parties to push through corporate tax reform. I honestly don't think it would have happened if there was a Democratic administration in charge. But the individual tax cuts can be pushed through, even under both sides, under a Republican or a Democratic administration. So I think they're gambling on the idea that the individual tax cuts will continue. The corporate tax cuts are permanent. That provides an incentive for businesses to come back to the U.S. to invest more, and to lead to higher jobs and wages for American workers. So, I do think that there are long-run impacts and there are short-run impacts. There's limited redistribution towards the lower end immediately, but I think the hope is that in the long run, more and more middle-class and lower-income workers will benefit from the corporate tax cuts as well.
We were Switzerland. We have no view on that. We just administer it.
So I might want to pick up on a couple of points that David mentioned where you might actually not have to be Switzerland on. But you've heard that there's a lot of things changing, and this is my time to bank thanks to all the VITA volunteers for next year, because this is going to be a challenge. And at the same time that they have put on the table of the IRS and VITA volunteers and tax preparers a huge set of tax changes across the board. IRS funding has been cut by nearly 20% since 2010 in real terms. So we're already at the sort of on the part of a slope that is not going in the right direction, given the increase in population, the increase in demand on the IRS even before this new bill. And now we're going to be facing challenges on implementing this as well. So I think one of my calls is that in addition to VITA funding, the IRS needs to be adequately funded, not only for the implementation of this tax bill, but for needs that were not being met even running up to this. And that funding has to be permanent and stable, because these changes, they're going to be around for at least 8 years and maybe longer. I'm hoping not, but there's a lot of work to be done, and it can't just all go towards customer service, although that's important. If we're going to talk a lot about the error rate and enforcement, those parts of the budget also have to be.
Totally.
For sure.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. I think that's the other side of the coin is, so we passed this historic tax legislation, and now we turn to the IRS. There wasn't any additional funding for the IRS to implement this. The IRS was already hurting pretty badly from funding cuts over the many years now. On top of that, there's only an acting commissioner now, although I see that there's a name that's been floated. I don't know if it's been officially put up for nomination yet on the Hill for a new commissioner who comes from the tax community. How does this, and there's also on top of that, we've heard from the tax advocate and from the IRS themselves about changes around how they do customer service. The VITA program is an important part of that as well, interfacing with low-income customers. How does this impact low-income tax filers, these changes, and what could that look like in the next year and the year beyond as these things start to roll out?
Boy, I can tell you there's a lot of brain power going into trying to game that out. I think, to everyone's point, there's uncertainty. How is this going to work? How is doubling the standard deduction? The lack of funds. I think there will be more efforts at reform, not on the tax code, but around refundable credits. I won't comment on whether it's right or wrong, but I think the administration is not done looking at that and looking at error rates and other things. I think there certainly will be challenges out there, but there's a lot of people trying to figure out what's going to happen.
Absolutely. There is going to be a lot of challenges. So already, on the day-to-day, we get folks coming in, why is my 2016 different from my 2017? And we made no changes last year. So I cannot imagine what it's going to be like next year when folks, there's difference in people's refunds and having to explain that to them. So people are asking me now how we're addressing that, and I'm saying we're not right now because we just need to get through this tax season, which is what I'm telling everybody. We are talking about astronomical changes in the way that we're going to be talking to clients about their tax, liabilities and tax changes. So yes, there's a lot of brainpower that's going to be going into that, but we still need a lot of that guidance from the IRS. I mean, we don't know what it's going to look like. And we've already been told from SPEC, which is the arm of the IRS that handles the VITA program, so stakeholders, partnerships, education, and communication, right, Don? Is what SPEC stands for, that they are really going to be, the IRS is really going to be focusing firsthand on the employment and the payroll side of things, getting information out to those folks first, and then the clients and customers at the end. So we just got to wait.
Yeah, I mean, I'd add to that. I think people have kind of lost sight of the fact that just like ACA, Dodd-Frank, all the rulemaking and implementation that has to go forth on this bill, there is a lot. I mean, you saw it on the property tax issue, that just the kind of frantic, like they had to get something out, then states were questioning it, there was threats of lawsuits. You know, Maryland had to vote to, to allow the county of Montgomery County, like, there is a lot. And I think the other thing, too, is they are looking at delaying refunds even more across other credits because there is a sense that it helped to reduce some improper payment rates. I'm not going to comment on whether this is right or wrong or anything, but I think the current administration is examining, as are some in Congress, whether this should be, extended and made for other parts. So I think the implementation and administration of this is now getting talked about. Yeah.
And I think that's really important to keep in mind when we're hearing a lot of buzz around the withholding and the paychecks, and the sort of the headlines are around, or the PR is around people's withholding going down and paychecks going up. But there are a lot of risks in this bill for low-income people. I mean, about 1/10 of low-income people will face tax increases because there are so many moving parts in the bill. So that's one thing to pay attention to. The other part is that, even for those that may be facing virtually no change or even small tax cuts, withholding is always an imprecise science. As you've heard, low-income filers, and the research bears this out, are very risk-averse to taking financial hits that are not expected. So I think, those having in mind some of these risks as implementation rolls out for people is particularly important for the low-income communities that we're talking about when we're discussing refundable credits.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's been many proposals too about kind of evening out refunds, because a lot of people receive large refunds at tax time. That large refund is something that's desired by a lot of low-income families, that they actually withhold intentionally to bump that up. And nobody minds seeing a little bit more in their check for the most case, but if that happens and folks see more in their check, but then tax time comes and they don't receive that same kind of bump up that they normally expect because of the confusion around this, that could throw off plans for a lot of low-income folks, because as many of you mentioned, people already have made up their mind about how they're spending this refund. They anticipate how much they're going to get, how they're going to pay their bills, and divvy that up. And if that's not there when it happens, it can leave them in a very fragile position.
I mean, I'll just say we do a lot of behavioral research into that fact. I mean, people want that lump sum check. It was a huge issue around ACA when we had to think through how were we going to break the news to somebody that their refund was going to be less because of the penalty or the mandate. And focus groups about breaking that news to people who thought they were going to get $2,000 and then it was like $1,000, but they had spent $2,000 in their head or on the credit card, already. Yeah. It's a huge issue. I'll just plug too on the IRS reform that we would be huge advocates of a kind of bump to help with technology upgrades. One of the biggest strains on their budget is where's my refund? I think 70% of their calls are where's the fact that in the age of Amazon, you have to call somebody and it's like either being processed or it's why you don't know where in the pipeline from the moment it was submitted to the moment the check appears, at your doorstep. Little things like that that's just in the 21st century, or getting your transcript is a totally you have to fax it in, it's mailed. These low-income people tend to not be in the same house or the same apartment frequently. They've moved addresses. For us, trying to get that information to help process it for the Treasury, it would resolve stuff faster and take the strain off of them. So any increase in revenue in money to IRS, we would hope would go to these investments that would be good for the taxpayer, it'd be good for all of the people at this table, and good for the Treasury.
I agree, but I think we need to be just a little bit thoughtful about the technology piece too, because, where's my transcript is great when it's working, right? And so also when we're thinking about the population that we're working with to get your transcript online, and this is just an example, you need to have a credit card or a mortgage or a car payment. And for a lot of our folks, that just isn't possible. Yep. So just thinking about funding the IRS too on some of their traditional services, because a lot of our folks just can't get that access online too. I'm definitely an advocate for the technology, but I know that it doesn't work for all of our folks.
Yep.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And then that's been part of the controversy around the IRS's future state proposal about this movement, which in many ways makes sense, moving to more technology, moving to these types of things. But when you're thinking about low-income families and those who are most vulnerable, that technology access, even if they can access it, can be very difficult. So making sure that those other services are still available to them, the TAC offices and others, because when they aren't, a lot of that burden falls to nonprofits, to VITA sites, to other community services, local services that have to bear that extra burden. So before I want to get to what improvements would look like, and we've hinted at this a lot in terms of both policy and administration. Before we get there, I think one important thing, since the discussion around fraud, error rates, overpayments, we've talked a lot about that. One thing, and Dan, you brought this up briefly, was around the PATH Act, the Protecting Americans from Tax Hike Act. That there was a lot of concern about that as it went into effect this past year for the first time, where it would delay EITC refunds for taxpayers because they are really dependent. As we know, the tax season opened yesterday. Was it yesterday or was it Monday? Folks line up right away. This is the busy time that everyone's trying to get their refunds, getting their money. And then if you tell them, wait, well, you can file now, but you're not going to get your refund for another couple weeks or beyond what you usually would get it, obviously that's not going to go over well for a lot of people who have been kind of already paid for a lot of this. They're waiting for their money. How has that played out? What do we know about the experience of that in terms of both the impacts on tax filers and households, but also has it been successful in helping to reduce overpayments or to clarify things? Do we know a lot about that yet? Or what can we say at this point?
I don't think there's been any data put out. I mean, anecdotally, I think I will actually say I think IRS reached more people with the news than people thought. I think that the industry, most people in this room may know, the EITC filers tend to come in the first, not only 2 weeks, 2 days. Like they tend to be first in the door. They're ready to go. They want the money. Like they're fired up and ready to go. They came in. That didn't happen last year across the industry, and for an industry that you guys probably won't be surprised that models down to the minute during season because you make a lot of your money, or it's kind of the showtime for the nonprofit. There was oh my gosh. And I think what people realized was the message penetrated that it's going to be delayed, et cetera. I think it did have some impact on reducing improper payments. We would be the first to say we'd love to see the data and have IRS put this out. I know people have asked at hearings, what did you do to match stuff? I think they're a little hesitant because one of the players in this is not just low income and unscrupulous, but the Russian mob and others that have figured out anytime you have large amounts of cash that go out, and if you're doing it, if you do it in retail, you recognize the person's face. If you do it online, you're an algorithm, and if there's more opportunity there. I think they're hesitant to tip off what they're doing and what the software screens and filters are doing because there's some really sophisticated crime syndicates that pay very close attention to that. So we have not seen information that's public. We've heard it behind closed doors.
Yes, and we would be the second that would love to see that data. But I agree that the market was, we saturated the market with information around the delay. We thought it was going to be a huge thing. We were all very worried and freaked out about it, that folks were going to be super upset. But a lot of our clients were like, okay, it's fine. We did, again, see the slowdown. I mean, and not everybody people weren't breaking down our doors as they usually are. It was the slow trickle in, which is different. But people mostly knew when they came in. They understood that it was going to be a delay, and they weren't upset about it. Now, I don't know if that means because that means that most people went elsewhere, and which is what we think, but are trying not to think about it, went elsewhere and got some sort of rapid refund product. But for all the people that came through our doors, they were mostly okay with it. They understood that it was going to happen and that they would have to wait.
I think that's a hugely important point. I mean, when this was enacted, Chairman Hatch said it was the most robust set of program integrity proposals in this area for decades. So giving it some time to play out and be implemented and find out what happened and whether or not there were adverse consequences for filers, the IRS, businesses, is an important thing to do before sort of charging headlong into other proposals that would sort of sit on top of this and potentially exacerbate some of those problems.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's good to hear, like, hats off to the IRS for kind of getting handed that at the last moment and working with their partners to give people a heads up so they didn't show up to the tax site surprised. I think, yeah, it'd be interesting to see as we get more data and as it hits this tax season as well. You know, there are good, going to VITA sites. There's good actors offering zero interest loans like Block, with no strings attached. But thinking about other less with other providers with less scruples that might attach costs to that or other conditions to that that are not transparent, or an uptick in payday lending access as well, since that's another area that will be of concern in the long term, given that CFPB rules look like they might be being opened up and rolled back in that area. Could be concerning over the long term, and is definitely something to kind of watch going forward. So the big question that I know this is the fun question that you all wanted to jump into, both in terms of tax policy and administration. What are, you could say missed opportunities in tax reform, but what are the potential improvements or the future improvements? Like what would be, and we've touched on a lot of these, at least some in more substance than others, but what would real reform look like? We have these programs, they work. If we make these families a priority and improving the system a priority, what would that package of changes look like? And as I said, both policy, but also in administration as well.
So I want to go first because I only have one. And that would be to expand the EITC for our folks that are not claiming children. That would be just a huge help. We are just leaving behind that set of folks and even taxing them further into poverty. As you said, the benefit that they receive is very little if they do not have children. In Maryland, we are working really hard to get the earned income tax credit at the Maryland state level increased for those folks. We're trying to, roll back the age, so we're trying to bring it down to 18 because right now you cannot claim the earned income tax credit until you're 25. Secondly, we're trying to increase the amount of incomes because right now it phases out at about $15,000, which is less than full-time minimum wage work. And then we are trying to make it 100% of the credit because right now we were able to raise the state EITC up until 28%. So right now this year it's 27% and it'll go up to 28% for tax year 2018. But we want to make it 100% of the federal because we think that would be a bigger impact for folks. Again, the max that you can get without children is $520. So that was a huge missed opportunity, fine. But moving forward, we really think it would be helpful if we could just expand the EITC for those folks and get them more cash back in their pocket. We're not saying that these folks are actually not supporting children because a lot of them are. And so giving them that extra money would be a help for the household with children as well. So if we could get that done at the federal level, that would make it easier for us at the state. So thanks.
I think I would just echo that. Some of the research that we've seen, again, because the EITC is so much more favorable to single parents and single mothers, especially with children, we see these positive labor force participation effects. I think if we did the same for childless adults or non-custodial parents, I think there's a potential for improvement there as well. So I would echo that, not just for to give more money to these families, but as we said, it's a pro-work policy, and I think encouraging people to be in the labor market because you get that EITC refund, I think is a great way to do it. The second thing is, again, on the error rate, as I said, more simplicity, defining a qualifying child so that people understand it, making it easier for people to file for the EITC to claim the refund. I think those are all, positive steps that we can take. And the third is the implicit sort of marriage penalty in the EITC, the fact that you lose some chunk of your EITC refund if you're filing jointly as opposed to filing as single parents. I think addressing that, there are a number of ways to do it. You can extend the plateau region where your benefits stay constant but for longer. or doing it through a secondary earner deduction by allowing you to deduct taxable income from the secondary earner while claiming the EITC. I think that's important as well. And in general, expanding the EITC as opposed to expanding several other tax credit programs that we know are not as well targeted towards the lower end of the income distribution.
Right. So overall, I would reverse course on the tax bill overall, as David mentioned, but we haven't talked a lot about on this panel. There's also the fact of those high income tax cuts potentially threatening other programs and funding for things that we care about in this area in the long term as we think about budget constraints or people who are going to say that there are budget constraints that need to be addressed through cuts to these programs. So that's an important part of the picture for low-income people generally. But I think I would totally echo childless worker, EITC, as you said, many of them are not childless. They're involved in children's lives, whether they live with them or not. That's a really important piece of the puzzle. There are a number of great proposals out there that would solve this problem of childless workers being taxed into or deeper into poverty by the federal tax system, which is the only group of workers that the federal tax code does this to. On the CTC, there was obviously a missed opportunity that we just missed there to make it more targeted and refundable at the bottom end. State EITCs, again, a really great piece of the puzzle, something that states can move on while they're waiting for federal action to build. And I think also just to mention, we've looked at some of these small pieces and ideas that have been around for a while, and these are all great things to move on. But again, in the context of sort of the big looming problems that are facing this economy and workers at low and middle incomes, thinking about stagnating wages, the pressures of globalization, other things that could be done, I think there are a number of more ambitious proposals out there that would fill the hole for childless workers, but also think about increasing the EITC across the board. There are proposals on the child tax credit that would not only sort of make steps towards making it more refundable, but think about things like full refundability, advanceability, more aggressive moves in that direction. And as steps towards that, thinking about boosts for young children in particular, where the research is particularly compelling that families that have young children tend to be more in poverty, and where the returns could be potentially higher for some of those children in terms of the health and educational benefits that we're seeing through the research. So I think there's a whole suite of great ideas that are out there. I think part of the step towards those great ideas is looking towards reversing course on some of the less great ones that have just been implemented.
Very diplomatic.
I'll make the plug again for minimum standards. From an administration standpoint, I just can't say it enough. There are a lot of scumbags in that sector, and you're never going to get rid of. If someone wants to commit a crime, you're never going to fully stop them. But some standards, some competency, and some form of a background check would be good. And then again, not commenting on tax legislation because that's not what we do. I think the changing household structure, the changing family structure, and this is kind of slightly off topic, but I think looking at how the economy is changing more broadly, I know some senators are looking at the social safety net in the era of the gig economy. Yeah. I think a lot of our policies are designed from the industrial era, from the 1950s, even the 1980s. Being a child of the 80s, I love the 80s, but the economy is rapidly changing, and I think both sides of the aisle are beginning to put a lot of thought into what is the proper scaffolding and structure, both from a tax policy and from a safety net standpoint, and we think they're onto something.
Yeah, definitely. So the other thing I would be remiss not to touch on, and I know many of you have thoughts on this Prosperity Now, as many of you know, we think a lot about savings, asset building, wealth, inequality. Folks come to tax, they come into tax time, as many people mentioned, they're looking at their immediate needs, they're trying to get by, they're trying to pay bills, they've already thought things through. But we also know from research too, such as that done by like Kathy Eden at Hopkins, that folks also want to save. And from behavioral science, we know there's ways to make this easier and better than others and block of course, has done some research on this, Dan, as you mentioned at the CFPB. Tax time is also a great time to help people improve their financial capability, to give them access to safe accounts, like a low-cost prepaid card, that can help them as a transaction or a bill payment account. Can you all talk a little bit about what we know about that, and other types of things? Jeremy mentioned, the Refund and Rainy Day Savings Act, which is legislation that was introduced by Senator Booker's, as another great bill that will be reintroduced in this Congress soon as well, and was in the last Congress, but is another way to access refunds for folks. What do we know about helping to improve that? Because as many people know the statistic, like almost half of Americans can't even come up with $400, that Federal Reserve statistic. And it's a pretty frightening statistic given the small amount of money that is and what we know about financial volatility. And given that people have this money at tax time and there is a need for it, what do we know and how can we improve that? Yeah.
Well, as I mentioned before, we put a lot of thought into this. There is a lot of research, Catherine Eaton's book, that very much showed that people, have spent that money in their head. We don't try to incentivize people's behavior. That's a tricky line. We have a challenge, and it's a high-class problem on some level, that because we see more people face-to-face than the IRS, because we would basically, though we are not financial advisors, legally speaking, we think we essentially are for a lot of low-income people. A lot of government agencies come to us and ask us for help to pitch their products. So My IRA, college savings plans during the ACA rollout. And I go back to when I started, you come in, it's late at night, you're tired, you're hungry, your kid's tugging on your leg. We can't sit there and be like, let me put 15 brochures in front of you and go through each one and talk about, you're just like, you'll walk out. Again, you'll go to the fly-by-night who's like, it'll take 5 seconds and here's your cash. Like, you don't even bring the shoebox. It is I think what we would say is to incentivize savings, to incentivize behavior is really, the time to do it is not in tax season. It is really outside the season, so that when you get to the desk or you're thinking, or the software, or however you choose, whatever platform you choose, that when you start thinking about that in December or November, that you're already there. And I think that it's really hard because agencies all the time are asking us, can you really try to encourage them to do that? And we put a lot of thought into it and study how do we meet their needs and how do we try to help them, but recognize that we're not, the nanny state telling them you need to do this, because it's pretty patronizing to say, you really should save more. You should get better health insurance. Have you thought about, sometimes people at the desk sit there and they just start talking to us, almost like a psychologist. Mm-hmm. We have tax pros who tell funny stories about how people ask them if they should get married.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that happened.
Should I marry her? And it's like, tax pros literally, they blush. They're like, yeah, it's totally awkward.
Except there's a tax reason too.
Well, yeah. So yes, they will. They will get into that. They will. We look at your life through tax, right? But it is a really, I think, so much work would need to go into outside of season.
Yeah. So Justin, just give me the 1 minute sign, so I'm going to be really quick, and I'm going to say, yeah, I do incentivize people to come and save for sure. And I am that person that's going to throw 15 brochures at you. I don't care. We really want to capitalize on the moment that we have people in front of us, and we're going to talk to them about savings. I don't care if you don't want to hear it. That's totally fine. But I want you to know, because as Dan said, we essentially do function as financial advisors for a lot of these folks. No one else is going to talk to them about their money, and so it's really important for us to be talking to them about these different savings opportunities. And my favorite stories about this is not when people say, yeah, I want to do this right now, because we totally understand. There's whole science about how you got to talk to people about it, right? But I love it when people come back the next year, because we do see returning clients. A big percentage of the folks that we see coming to us every single year is when they say, I want to buy a savings bond this year. I couldn't do it last year, but somebody talked to me about it. Right now, it's got great savings rate return, bigger than any savings account you've got. And I want to buy a savings bond this year. I couldn't do it last year, I couldn't do it the year before, but this year I can do it. And it's all because somebody talked to me about it. And if you don't talk to folks about it, they're not going to know. And so we pride ourselves at our Vitasite to talk to people about savings and incentivize about. I mean, we've got bells, we've got whistles, everything. If you decide to save $50, like, we are throwing you a party. So, because, you know, it's just the nature of the folks that we deal with, we have to talk to them about it. And so I'm just going to leave that there.
I think the evidence from the research is actually more optimistic. I mean, it does turn out that people use their lump sum EITC payments for big ticket items like cars or savings, or, you know, if they're planning to move, or tuition payments. So, you know, I think that's one of the reasons why when they had the opportunity to take the advanced EITC, it wasn't a very successful program, because people like the fact that they're forced to save and get that, you know, $2,000 check at the end of the year, and that they can use to do a lump sum buy, or, you know, something big. So I think, you know, people are smart, and I think, you know, education matters and financial literacy matters, but I think at least the evidence that we have so far suggests that people are using it for the right reasons.
Yeah.
I think just to add to that, I think, you know, we've talked a bit about the sort of the contrasting experiences people have and the research. Some people really, really like that lump sum, yet you'll have other research that shows that people are really cash-strapped leading up to that tax time, and say they would appreciate having emergency savings at that point and would use a vehicle like an emergency savings fund. So I think one of the things, you know, my way of squaring that circle is that people's lives are different and complicated and change. So any proposal in this area has to take that into account, that what is good for one family might not be good for another, and to give that flexibility and that option to change their minds over time as their circumstances change. So I think that's one of the things that I really appreciated about the Rainy Day Fund that you worked on, that it had that flexibility as part of the core goal. The other part that is really important, and we talked about it a bit before, is that low-income and moderate-income individuals are very risk-averse of taking a financial hit. So again, another part of that proposal that I liked was that there was no risk of anyone having to pay back an amount. And so in terms of when I look at proposals in this area, those are the two main things that I look for: that flexibility, and that you're not creating a risk for someone of having to pay back a match or whatever else it was. So I appreciate that. The other thing I just wanted to mention, the MyRA came up. That's no longer. So that's another area in which there was a sort of a promising pilot where we could at least have learned some things about how people responded to that over time. This was the last administration set up a flexible savings account that was low risk, that people could access independent of an employer. This administration has said that they're not going to continue that. I think we could have learned some things about that over time if we'd persisted a little bit, but again, an area where we're making steps backwards.
Sorry, I know we're wrapped for time, but I would be negligent if I didn't say that the H&R Block's philanthropic activity, our main, is financial literacy. And we sponsor high school competitions all over the country to teach people the basics of managing a budget, recognizing that you'll have, you know, immigrants who run the finances for the whole family, and we give scholarship money for it to the winners. The CEO flies around, literally hands out the checks, but that is our philanthropic effort, and has been for years, is financial literacy.
Yeah. No, thank you all. So before I'll ask the panel one final question, then we'll go to you all for your questions. But just as a wrap up, this can be a choose your own adventure question, and or and just any general final thoughts you want to share, and or where do you see things being a year from now for low-income families? Like, not that since this is such an easy time to predict what's ahead in the year ahead, but like, but as far as impact on actual low-income families, positives or negatives or issues that you're looking out for in the year ahead, of the many that we haven't already covered, where do you think things will land? Or if you just want to do any final thoughts, you could do that as well. But then we'll go to everyone else's questions after that.
I'll just repeat my thanks again to VITA volunteers, to people that are on the ground making sure that people can access these credits, that are doing preparation that's responsible and well-informed. I think that's a huge part of what low-income people's experience over the next year is going to be. So thanks for this season. Thanks in advance. I know many of you working deeply in this area, so thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, I would just say, I think there is a lot of uncertainty. I do think on net, a lot of families, at least in the very short run, might see some larger after-tax paychecks coming in. There's always the worry about, if you're a very large family and the standard deduction has only double and the personal exemptions are gone, maybe, you might see a slight hit to your tax bill. But I think on net, most families will either be held whole or, maybe see a slight boost in their after-tax income. And then, hopefully we'll see some more action on the EITC, and maybe that's the next issue that this administration could look into.
We love everybody. We are Switzerland. We look forward to seeing where the train goes on the tracks. It's never dull these days. So.
Yeah. And I would just echo that, we really, in a year, we would just want our families and individuals, the people that we care about, to be held harmless. I just want everybody to be, held whole, in a good place. I don't want there to be just, all these conversations where I'm giving bad news to people all the time, because those just suck. But again, I just kind of want it all to work out.
That's a good place to end it. So, questions from the audience? Yeah. No.
So, Francesca, can you tell us, take us under the hood around how VITA gets to 93%?
Yeah. Absolutely. So first of all, it's training. We put our volunteers through a lot of training. The IRS is gracious enough to come up with a lot of these training materials and a certification exam that we have to certify all of our volunteers each and every year. It doesn't matter if you've been doing this for 25 years. It doesn't matter if you're an attorney like me. You still have to certify. You still got to take a test every single year to make sure that you are up to date on all of these tax issues. So we put our volunteers anywhere between 16 and 24 hours of training. And then they take the certification test. And then we have them come volunteer. Usually we do soft openings with some of our larger sites so that we can put our eyeballs on all of our volunteers and just sort of, and give them a soft introduction where everyone is nice and friendly in the tax season, just to get them started. So a lot of training. We have an amazing tax team. We're now 5 people strong, which is awesome. That comes up with this training, puts it together, and really gets folks through it. It's, 6 months, actually, that we're thinking ahead. So tax season for us is never really over. We're thinking about training in May. Like, as soon as, I send in the IRS report, I'm thinking about training all over again, just so that we can get our volunteers ready.
I'd say we would fully support VITA standards being the basis of minimum standards. We think they're great.
Well, thanks, Dan.
As we think ours are great, too.
I think yours are good, too. I've done your 60 hours. It's good.
Rochelle Friedman with the Coalition on Human Needs. Thanks so much for Prosperity Now for doing this wonderful panel. When I volunteered at VITA sites, I too experienced people coming in absolutely delighted with their refunds. I also occasionally would see people coming in who unknowingly were classified by employers as individual contractors, and not only did they not get a refund, but they owed the employer part of FICA. Particularly Francesca and Dan, I wondered if that was your reality as you work on the ground with people. And is there a way to hold unscrupulous employers responsible without risking that the individual employee would lose their job?
That's a good question. Yeah.
Boy, I would go back to what I said earlier about, I think this is something government is looking at, not necessarily your specific, but the economy is changing. You read in the headlines, Airbnb, Uber, all wonderful companies, but there's issues out there. I know Senator Mark Warner, for one, is really putting a lot of thought into. So specific to yours, I've not heard our tax pros necessarily speak to that, but it is an issue that as a business, we're trying to think through compliance and administration and headaches that are coming up.
So yes, we have seen that quite a bit, and actually we've gone through it. The largest offenders actually are hospitals around home health care aides, who basically the folks that work for them are employees. When you go through what the tax code, and because there's actually no definition, right? But there are these tests where these different things that a person has to go through in order to be considered an employee. And so it kind of boils down to control, but there are a bunch of different factors. And so they absolutely meet the test to be an employee, but they're treated as independent contractors because folks want to save a couple of bucks, right? The problem is there is nothing that we can do about it without there being some repercussion for the employee. I mean, the only thing that can happen is that they can file with the IRS. There's a special form that they can submit that will have the IRS make a determination about whether or not they are actually an employee or an independent contractor. We know that it takes a long time. It takes at least 6 months. And in that time, the IRS launches an investigation and they talk to everybody, including the employer. So the employer is informed that there's an investigation that is going on. And so what's the likely result, right, at the end of that when an employer knows that they're being investigated? That employee no longer has a job. So unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about it. The remedy that we have come up with is around education. So, we talk to those folks about all the things that they can do in order to offset some of that self-employment income, because that's really what the problem is. They have to pay the self-employment tax. So we talk to them about the importance of record keeping, making sure that they have all of the receipts for any of the expenses that they have. Thank you. That they're paying quarterly estimated tax payments or tax payments in general, because I always say the IRS and the comptroller will take your money whenever, so it doesn't have to be on their schedule. But just really trying to do what they can to be prepared for that, for tax season, because there's nothing worse than earning 40 grand, paying no taxes on it, and then what you realize is that you owe $7,000 at the end of the tax season.
I bring bad news from the new tax bill. This is another area where the recent law changes are going to probably muddy the waters and create a risk of making things worse in this area. There's a new gigantic tax avoidance opportunity around the so-called pass-through deduction, which creates a big incentive for high-income filers in particular to set themselves up as independent contractors or businesses in order to claim a tax break on their salary and wages. It also creates a potential for more confusion, particularly for unscrupulous employers, to create pressure for treating their employees as independent contractors or pass-throughs, perhaps with those filers not realising the employment protections, the benefits, and some of the other tax downsides that might come with that. So this is going to be a huge implementation and avoidance issue across the tax code, but it also intersects with this issue too.
Yeah, I think especially it may not seem like an issue that would affect low-income workers, and this is where the uncertainty comes in, and you can file this under don't do tax reform in 5 weeks, but you look at enough higher income employees who take the pass-through, that obviously has implications for benefits, health insurance, retirement, others for them personally, but if enough people opt out of the system, the way health insurance is shared risk pooling, even though there are some members of Congress who don't realize that sometimes, but it's shared risk pooling, and when you pull people out of that, the costs are going to go up, obviously. So that could have an indirect effect. It's one of those areas that we don't know as far as retirement plan participations, health insurance, a lot of other important benefits. So it's something that we could be talking about in a year or two or further down the road as being a big problem. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Hi, and Julie Kirksick from Community Advocates Public Policy Institute in Wisconsin. I have a question and then a comment or piece of information I want to share. Let me start with the question. Why did the tax reform so clearly leave the EITC out? Are there answers among the panelists that you can share? And whatever those answers are, do they have implications for what we should be trying to do from the heartland when we're trying to influence in DC? So that's the question. The second thing I just want to mention is we are working very much on trying to pilot or get interest in piloting approaches to periodic payment, not just one. My experience from the national scene is that players tend to settle on one and go shop it, and we're trying to generate some thinking about, honest brokering, if you will, of the pluses and minuses. And the information is that there is a state bill right now in Wisconsin that would pilot a very tiny periodic payment that is not the approach we think is a good one, but we're happy to see that it's even out there. So we're going to see if that can be helpful to the national picture as well. Thanks.
So I can take that. On the EITC, I think the only reason why I would imagine that it wasn't part of the bill was this, I have heard some Republicans and some policy people also worry about the compliance rate. I mean, the error rate, basically. The fact that we are spending, you can think of it as spending, but basically we're overpaying and a lot of the money is going out. And so unless you fix that, there's some resistance to expanding the program even further. I think the other reason why they went with the child tax credit and not the EITC is because when you took away the personal exemptions, you wanted to return more of the money all across the income scale rather than just at the lowest end. So I would imagine if there was a budget, any budgetary concern, which there doesn't seem to be, but if there were, they would go with the CTC because it would hold, many more people whole than just an EITC expansion. So I think there are probably these two reasons why they didn't, put it into the bill, because the EITC would have been very targeted and very focused just at the low end.
So I think this is one of these areas where there were many promises made about what a tax bill would look like before we went into it. That President Trump said in his inaugural that every decision he made on a range of things, including taxes, would be to focus on working Americans and middle-income families. That's not the distribution of this tax bill. We heard that there would be simplification. We're not talking about filing on a postcard or putting vital workers out of work.
We love everybody.
No comment.
We heard that there would be no absolute tax cut for high-income people. That's not the case. And some of these, I think some of these rationales that Apana is struggling to find, I think are really, really very generous. If we talk about the error issue, again, this bill creates gigantic avoidance and error opportunities for high-income people and multinationals. This tax bill was simply a result of policy preferences and choices that were made. And the choice was made to write an instruction that allowed $1.5 trillion to go onto deficits for tax cuts. And then Congress chose to make corporate tax cuts the only permanent part of that, and chose to make those so big that they had to be paid for in the long run by repealing the individual mandate and a chained CPI that increases taxes across the board. And once you make those choices, you're kind of forced to raise taxes on millions of low and moderate income people and have nothing left over to put into the EITC and CTC. But again, that forced choice is a result of a whole series of choices and policy preferences that led up to that point. So, I mean, I think this is very much a case of look at what I say as opposed to what I do, and the outcome of this tax bill is not consistent, in my view, with a focus on working families.
I'm just going to say a round of applause, because that was like a diplomatic answer that I just could not have come out with. Thank you.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is just, one thing that we haven't talked about in depth is, the earned income tax credit is it's been around for a long time, and it's an incredibly bipartisan history, right? President Reagan expanded it. Was started by President Nixon, I believe, as an alternative to a negative income tax. President Clinton expanded it further. It's traditionally been very bipartisan. It obviously incentivized work. The data shows that. The problem is that some members of the Republican Party now hold a hostility toward poor families, and this is a program that targets poor families, and that even though it incentivizes work, there's this sense, and we've heard this throughout different comments on the panel, that poor people they're either lazy, there's something deviant in their behavior, and they don't know how to best spend their money. And for the most part, all those things are not true, right? No more than any other member of the population. Income has nothing to do with it. And then when you trust people and you give them access to income and you incentivize work, these are all positive things, and people can get ahead. And this is next week. Many of you probably are familiar with Prosperity Now. I do our annual scorecard, which releases state data on a variety of indicators related to finances, as well as healthcare, education, and others, and labor. This is a major theme of that, is that You know, we've had comments from members of Congress talking about how poor people don't know how to spend their money, or they're spending it too much here and there, not recognizing that people are really working hard. They're barely getting by. The costs of healthcare, education, all these essentials, housing are going up. It's not that they're going to Best Buy and buying TVs and doing all these types of things. It's that they're feeling these constraints in an environment where not everyone is benefiting from a stock market hitting a 25,000, and you know, an unemployment rate at you know, around 4% is great as well, but you know, that is not enough, and too many of those jobs are low-wages jobs. So I think those are the real strictures that are out there right now, and there's a disconnect about how to help both help those people, but not seem like they're giving away things to poor people who are not going to do the best thing with them. So
the only thing I would just add on this is part of your delegation, Speaker Ryan, has been in favor of expanding the EITC.
Yeah.
And I think that I would agree with Chai-Chi. I think at the end of the day, the reconciliation instructions created the parameters of the sandbox that, you know, whatever your priorities were, they had to fit in that. And there was a lot of, you know, tugging both ways. If you support the EITC, and again, you know, I keep saying it, we're Switzerland, we're not commenting on that, you want a lower improper payment rate.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes parties lose sight of that, right? There are some who say, even if it goes to people who don't deserve it, that's okay. Yeah. But then when you go to expand it, it's like a hear no evil, see no evil. And I'm not saying that the critics are right in their rationale. Like, you know, as is often the case, the answer is somewhere in between improper payment and just complication, and almost absurdly so. Mm-hmm. But it is in the interest of both parties to bring that improper payment rate way down. And then you will help people like Speaker Ryan and others in both parties who want to get this done have the breathing room and the space to get it done. But when you're talking 18, 20 billion a year, and I get it's not, you know, it may be somewhere a little bit lower. It's hard to say, let's expand this to a bigger pool of people. And I know there's strong feelings on this, but I think the less improper payment, lower improper payment, the better odds are of expanding it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It is, when you look at the tax gap, it is certainly nowhere near the largest part of the tax gap, but it is an actual
money.
And it is, you know, there is the distinction between overpayments and fraud. There is some fraud in there, but overpayments is a big part of it. And, you know, I think one thing that we keep coming back to in the panel is that the majority of people who are getting earned income tax credit are not filling out the forms themselves. They're going to a paid preparer to do that. And they're not always going to be someone who's like a highly trained VITA or block representative. They're going to people who may not have the best incentives involved. So one of the best ways to really lower that is to do paid tax preparer, basic competency standards for paid tax preparers.
I mean, I won't go too wonky. I forget the name of the Georgetown students that for their PhD studied the EITC and did the optimization chart. Literally goes like this, and throughout the last 20 years, in boom economies and busts, it remained absolutely consistent. That's not a random occurrence. Yep. And what is often the case is the IRS will not come after you if you over-report. They say, great, you're paying more taxes. I mean, people aren't stupid. Yep. And that's got to at some point get addressed in over and under payments for the health of the credit, because it's a great tool in people's lives.
So I'm hearing more funding for the IRS out of that.
Totally.
And whether there are any efforts, immigration status of EITC filers, and whether there are any efforts to expand that.
So you need a social security number to claim the EITC. Unlike with the CTC, you used to be able to have an ITIN to be a legal immigrant to claim the CTC. Unfortunately, as Chai Cheng pointed out earlier, that is no longer the case, given the new tax law was one of the negative changes to the child tax credit.
As Switzerland, we're not touching immigration. All I'll say is, you know, the current administration's got strong views on that.
right? And the only other thing that I can say about it is, you know, it's heartbreaking when when these folks come in the door and you tell them that they don't qualify for their earned income tax credit. So we absolutely feel that in our hearts when we have to talk to people about that. You know, when you think about these folks that are here working, trying to do the right thing, get taxes done, you know, doing the best that they can to be ingratiated into this country, and one of the biggest benefits that we can provide families, we just can't give them is heartbreaking. Thank you.
I mean, it's counterproductive in terms of, you know, both poverty and hardship for those families. It's also counterproductive in terms of long-run tax code compliance. You want people in the tax system. You want them filing from a perspective of good tax compliance. And it's also economically counterproductive when you look at that research around how these credits help people succeed in the economy. You want that for stronger communities and for the economy as a whole.
So one last quick question, and then we'll go to Jeremy to wrap.
Yeah, my name's Carl Polzer, and I started a project called the Center on Capital and Social Equity that works towards greater financial inclusion, inequality, ink.org. So 2 questions, and they go to the take-up rate. So what if we had a hypothetical situation where there's an industry or a large employer where there's a whole lot of people eligible, like long-term care, people making $10 an hour, a lot of women with kids, and you really had a focused effort to get the free tax service in, what's the percentage that you could increase the take-up rate by? And the second one's kind of a search for an honorable industry or not a dishonorable one, as we heard before, or large employer. I know some smaller ones. Do you know of any employer or industry that would be open to or has, in a mass way, helped employees do this? Because really, the economic research I've looked at, a third of the incidence of it goes to them. They get a financial benefit. Of course, it does focus on the wage, the bad wage that they're paying the worker, but I just think there's a potential for employer involvement. Those are my questions.
Wonderful question. So Maryland actually is one of the states that has a employer requirement that all employers must notify their employees that they might be eligible for the earned income tax credit. We actually helped pass that law a few years ago because that is a great idea. You know, employers are, you know, are the best partners around this. So we don't know what the take-up rate is. The thing is, we were able to get the law passed, but we weren't able to get any penalties assigned to it because that was one of the only ways we could get it passed. And there just hasn't been any research available around what the take-up rate has been as a result of that, of us passing that bill. It's on our list. It's one of the things that we are really interested in knowing. Just, you know, when we're serving 22,000 people, there are kind of a couple of things we're you know, busy doing. But yes, you definitely think that having employers be part of this conversation is important. We've definitely done some really small-scale efforts, shopped some employers to see if they are being compliant. And for the most part, we have seen a couple of large retailers in Maryland that have been doing it. They just blanketly give out the letter to everybody just so that they're covered. And, you know, the comptroller is a really great partner of ours. And, you know, he always has the website updated and has a letter posted that on the website that employers can just download and use and send it out to their employees. So it's on our list. We think it's a great idea. I just don't have any research or data around it. But we thought about it.
And look, we're a for-profit business. We are constantly looking at those opportunities to have it as a benefit for employees. To say, yeah, if it's going to cost them $150 an employee and they're going to get back an extra, $1,500, that's a heck of a leverage bonus. So if you want to promote agent, no, I'm just joking. That's something that we look at. Yeah.
And let me just piggyback off this. The Center on Budget's EITC outreach campaign. There's a flyer in the packet of materials. Looks at a whole range of different outreach methods, including through various community nodes, employers. I think my colleague Roxy Keynes is here somewhere, waving down the back. So she's got a whole, there's a website and a whole database of a whole set of different strategies that VitaSites and others have been using across different states to try and get that outreach and uptake increased.
Great. So thanks so much to the panel. Now we'll turn to Jeremy for some brief closing remarks. Yeah.
Well, first, I want to thank Chai-Ching, Dan, Francesca, Aparna, David. Please, let's give them a round of applause for this really great panel. And want to thank again Lauren and her team, H&R Block again for being a sponsor, and Senator Brown for giving us this space to have this conversation. Right now, Democrats are having a retreat, so he wasn't able to join us personally, but he was here last year and is really passionate about this issue. I also want to thank, because I think it's important, I want to follow Chai-Ching's lead and thank the civil servants at the IRS. Want to thank the people at companies like H&R Block that really care about their customers and the financial well-being of their customers. And, we're recording this, so I hope it gets out to these people. The VITA volunteers that work a whole day at whatever job they do, go to school, all those things, and then they spend the free time that they have, that precious free time that they have in the evening on the front lines in the war on poverty. So I definitely want to thank those people because they are the accelerant that really lights the fire under this field. So with that, one last thing I wanted to mention, if you want to keep this conversation going, it is hashtag future of EITC. Keep the conversation going on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all of the favorite things. My son might actually see what I did today if you do. And again, this is being videotaped, so please share, which will be out soon. So please share the link with all of your partners, all the people you work with, for people that need to know about it, because this is a really important program. And again, thank you for coming out and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.